Here we are in Area 12, and finally we have arrived in the 20th century. And we don't have to make it far into the 20th century before we need to stop and pause and give some attention to the Pentecostal revival. Arguably one of the most significant events in the life of the worldwide church in a long time. If you grew up in traditional Southern evangelical culture, you may know of Pentecostals, but your knowledge may be a little bit limited. They may be like your really happy and slightly odd cousin who shows up at family reunions and you wonder if they came to the wrong event. Trust me, you are related. In fact, Pentecostal churches have been some of the fastest growing churches worldwide in the last 100 years. Whether we agree with them theologically or not, we need to have some understanding of what has been transpiring in this movement. Really important movement that we need to understand, and that certainly fits the topic of our class very well. The Pentecostal movement in America traces its roots back to the turn of the 20th century, when a group of Bible college students in Kansas began speaking in tongues during a campus revival meeting. The president of the college, a man named Charles Parham, began to travel and tell the story of what had happened at his college, and he began to see others pick up the practice of speaking in tongues as well. It was under Parham's influence that a black holiness minister named William Seymour experienced glossolalia, the technical term for speaking in tongues. He moved from Texas to California, and he opened a church that met on Azusa Street. And for the next several years, this little church in California became the epicenter of what we now call the Pentecostal revival. As word of this event, of this new movement spread, people traveled from all over the United States and from other countries as well to experience, to watch, to study, and sometimes to be changed by this revival. The movement in its early days was remarkably racially diverse. Considering that all of this was happening in the early 1900s during the Jim Crow era, even more remarkable. And the movement was remarkably egalitarian, meaning that women played important roles in a variety of capacities within the new movement. Well, as time passed and denominations formed around various parts of the movement, the racial inclusivity disappeared as blacks and whites formed separate denominations, as often has been the case in the United States. And ultimately, the Pentecostal movement was no exception. At the heart of Pentecostalism is the belief in speaking in tongues. But along with that comes the belief in the manifestations of other spiritual gifts, like healing. Essentially, all of the ways that the Spirit was manifest in the book of Acts are still applicable today from a Pentecostal perspective. By the early 1900s, most traditional denominations taught that certain manifestations of the Spirit only applied to the New Testament period. They weren't applicable any longer to them in the 1900s. Pentecostals brought a different understanding and interpretation and hermeneutic to the biblical text to the table. For most, these new ideas were combined with the holiness Methodist tradition, which had emerged in the late 1800s that emphasized sanctification and right living and even perfectionism to some degree. So that's a piece of the puzzle. And then they also brought a fervent evangelism, and they brought a desire to really connect with lower income parts of society. There had sort of been a gap that had emerged there. Once upon a time, Baptists and Methodists sort of started at the low economic scale of things, but over time they advanced socially and economically and sort of had risen to the middle class. So who's going to come in and fill sort of the gap that they left behind? Well, the spirit of Pentecostalism and the message of Pentecostalism connected very well with folks in that situation. Similarly, the Pentecostal movement made significant inroads throughout South America and Africa and Asia, again, where the practice of healings and exorcism and the belief in demons and other spiritual forces fit well with the experience of many people in those parts of the world. So Pentecostalism becomes a major global force very, very quickly, all things considered. And the geographical reach of Pentecostalism remains quite impressive. Included in this story is the emergence of the Pentecostal Free Will Baptist Church right here in North Carolina in the early 1900s. The story is that a few pastors of the Free Will Baptist tradition who were living in eastern North Carolina at the time were intrigued by what they were hearing and reading about the Pentecostal revival in California. And so several of them road tripped, made a visit to Azusa Street, started speaking in tongues, were convinced of this biblical teaching, and brought it back to Free Will Baptist churches in eastern North Carolina. Needless to say, most of those churches did not receive well the message of Pentecostalism. And so most rejected that message, but some shared in the experience. And as a result, the Pentecostal Free Will Baptist Church was formed. Now, it's interesting that it keeps Pentecostal and Baptist in their name. They had that sort of historical tradition. They are much more Pentecostal today than they are Baptist. In case you're looking for a church home, you need to know what you're getting into. But it speaks of the reach and the influence across denominational lines that Pentecostalism has had, even making inroads in some places into the Catholic Church, where Pentecostal practices have been embraced. The Episcopal Church, in very rare instances, there have been some movements that have embraced Pentecostalism as well. And so it is a significant movement within Christian circles, and hopefully this has been a little helpful, getting some of that straight, and hopefully some of the readings that you'll have from the PDFs, the Christian history links that I've provided on Blackboard for this week will be helpful to your understanding as well.